Now I'd like to welcome to the show David McGarry, Research Director at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Welcome to Free the Economy, David.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So the here in Washington D.C. For once, normally we talk about a lot of national, federal level news, but we've got some local stuff here that I think is important. People love to hear about. The D.C. Council recently voted to move forward with a multi-billion-dollar subsidy package for the redevelopment of the site of Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium. For people not from DC, that stadium was built all the way back in 1961, later named after the late Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and was previously home to NFL franchise, DC's NFL franchise, the Washington Redskins, now the Washington Commanders, among other teams. Uh, David, is this deal a good idea?
Well, it is certainly not, though I think it has to do with something that is a little bit broader than simply a stadium deal. I testified against this deal at the DC City Council, and one thing struck me as I was sitting for about 10 hours in the hearing room before my name was called. And specifically, that was that this deal seems to be to various interest groups and to many of the residents of the city a golden ticket to all sorts of economic prosperity. And I should tell your listeners, deal does not only include a stadium; it includes a very large redevelopment project, which will have a hotel, we will have multiple parking structures. It will have bars, restaurants, a grocery store, a skate park, a dog park, open common areas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and and in attempting to raise the political capital for the approval of this deal, I think what the DC city government has done is it has created a behemoth that will be almost impossible to operationalize. It's created a massive gambit at central planning, which is all but certain to fail to produce the results that the DC government hopes to produce.
So that you recently wrote this up, and it was a sort of fascinating article about the background of this and getting neck deep into the actual democratic process. I think is fascinating. You know, going to this DC Council session. And I think you said the full session, the full hearing lasted like 13 hours, which maybe those DC local politicians earn their paychecks after all. But the process of that being surrounded by people expressing their views, what was that like? And like you said, you had to wait an enormous amount of time in order to get your turn at the mic. Um, what was the sort of like preponderance of attitude there? What was the for and against? What kind of things were people talking about? And did you feel like most of these people were kind of like normal people, or were they all representing some bigger group or company or special interest?
Well, I hate to start off by disagreeing with you, but in fact, the DC City Council did not earn its paycheck as for most of the hearing, there were but two or three members behind the dais, and the rest of them were off doing whatever else. Um, no, the preponderance of the witnesses who testified, of which there were over 500, supported the deal. And I think their reasons for supporting the deal were various and they were very interesting. Most of the public had bought the notion that this deal would spark an entire economic redevelopment of the stadium district and the surrounding area, and they had bought the line that had been fed to them by the political leaders. And I think understanding that a lot of the broad popular support for this deal stems not only from the fact that people like their sports teams as they should, but the fact that they have bought into a sort of narrative that contravenes all of the economic evidence about what stadiums are good for and how well cities can affect these sorts of projects. Yeah, I think that's to be noted as sort of the starting place. But besides the citizens who testified, there were a number of special interests. This goes from traditional special interests such as labor unions, which eventually managed to secure labor agreements for the construction of the stadium and the hotel that is to be built, but also ideologically based special interests. And in by that I mean the environmentalist groups, which were able to secure maybe not their wildest net zero dreams, for which many testified, or many for which many spoke in favor of net zero at the hearing, but they did get some environmental standards built in. There were also, for example, there were criminal justice advocates, and indeed, 15% of the jobs that are to be created in these construction projects will be, as promised by the commanders, offered to, I believe, what the team terms justice involved individuals, or as one of my Dias mates while testifying termed justice impacted individuals.
So those would be the ex-cons.
Yes, precisely.
So if there aren't enough ex-cons around to fill the 15% job set aside, they may have to renegotiate that. Um, so you know you wrote about or you wrote about this in your piece, and then mentioned it just now that uh, a lot of people in DC who have an opinion about this at all seem to be in favor of it because they have the impression that it'll be this sort of giant kind of multiplier effect for economic activity. That whatever the argument seems to be that whatever taxpayer subsidies go into it, there'll be some, huge multiple on top of that, we'll all get to share, local, Washington, D.C. residents. Um, I'm skeptical of that. And as you point out, there's a lot of academic research about deals like this, specifically stadium details, even, but other economic development deals in general that are created by local governments. And that don't support the idea that there will be some big positive externality of extra money and wealth flowing around just because the local government spends a million, a billion, whatever taxpayer dollars uh, on these deals. That there's a quote near universal consensus that sports venues do not generate large positive effects on local economies, and the obvious response to that is yes, there's a lot of economic activity going on when you build a stadium and you have games and you have all this other stuff that's going around it, but all of that money is just spent there instead of some other place in the city. You're just sort of redirecting it. You're not creating this big positive multiplier effect. Is that fair?
That's entirely correct. And the thing that dawned on me as I was sitting in the hearing room, probably somewhere as I entered some sort of coma around hour three, was that the advocates of the stadium subsidies seem to believe near universally that all good things would flow from this project. They could get everything they wanted. They could get economic rejuvenation, a cultivation of civic pride, etc., simply from this one package. And there was also the impression that this stadium was sort of the last best hope of the city to accomplish these things. And as you point out, there's no economic data that show that stadiums do anything more than redistribute consumer spending from other parts of the city to stadium districts. And of course, this raises questions, not only of economic prudence, but a sort of basic fundamental justice question about whether city officials should be involved in spending taxpayer monies to take revenue from some businesses based on their geographic location and redistribute it to others based on their geographic location. Um, but but I think a lot of this goes back to the simple basic fact that sports are really really cool and people like them. The process for this entire episode was done completely backwards. And instead of getting public input, um, and then doing some sort of competitive bidding process and then taking a vote on the issue, the council sort of flipped things. The Mayor Bowser announced that we were to have a deal, and then the deal was negotiated, and then only, let's see, 3 days before the vote was this hearing held, offering the public a chance to give their voice. And throughout this process, first of all, the city did not, in any meaningful sense, put into action its considerable negotiating power in this matter. And secondly, there was very little consideration that was given to the alternate uses to which this this land could be put. And I think this is crucial because even coming at it from a non-free market perspective, sort of taking off my free marketeer hat, there are many other ways that the government could spend money to make use of this land. And there's no evidence to show that the stadium is the best way. In fact, there's some evidence that shows that tax revenues would be higher if it were simply turned into a multi-use district. Um, and nonetheless, there's this fiction advanced that the stadiums have some sort of magical capacity for economic growth and to pull some of these admittedly struggling areas out of poverty. And that's simply not true. And I think it was a shame that the DC city government was willing to tell its constituents such a frankly ridiculous narrative in light of the data, and tell them things that were simply not true in order to cultivate broad popular support.
Well, yeah, and I've been listening to this, someone who lives in DC for years. The Redskins left RFK Stadium a long time ago, and then it was used with the local soccer team and so for some other events. But it's been on the sort of the plan has been to sort of phase it out for many years now. Um, uh, Coming up to the last few years when there have been no events there. Uh, so this has been a conversation that's been ongoing. And in that whole time, many, many years, there seems to have always been the assumption that what is the DC Council going to plan for? What is the DC Council going to decide goes on this site? And it never seems to have occurred to anyone that the city can just sell this land to the highest bidder and let a developer build whatever they want there, right? Consistent with, existing, zoning and laws, right? There was always this idea that somehow the city has to micromanage every aspect of this giant master plan, of what is it, like a couple hundred acres in the middle of the city, rather than just allowing the land, just like it would be any place else, allowing the land to be sold to someone who wants to build something on it and just letting them, via con Dios, go with God, build the best thing you can to make some money because you're a property developer. Um, do you think we're just sort of forever stuck with this idea that big projects have to be micromanaged by like city and regional governments? Is there any hope that we could possibly say in this or in a similar situation, the city owns some land, they're going to sell it off, auction it to the highest bidder, and then go forward from there?
Well, Washington, D.C. being what it is politically, any hope for that in American cities, generally speaking, would probably not be present here. But I think it's actually worse than you describe. As I mentioned, the facilities to be built are wide-ranging. They're diverse. They're numerous. As I said, dog parks, skate parks. I believe pole vaulting facilities are somewhere in there. A recreation center for youth sports. Um, a planned grocery store, facilities that will offer academic help to kids. And the question when you get into the nitty gritty of this is not just is the city competent to plan this sort of thing out, but the team is going to be making substantial investments in this and playing a hand in the construction and the planning of all of this. And the question is an NFL team competent to plan all of this? I mean, really, at the end of the day, I think something that community organizers say that I heard at the hearing is that the community needs to be involved in determining what its wants and needs are. And oddly enough, I think this plan contravenes all of that. This plan takes many of these decisions, which can only be made by individuals or by smaller communities, and for the period of decades shuffles them off to a very large business, meaning the team, and to a certain extent the city government.
Well, yeah, if only we had a way of figuring out what people actually want. I would say that could be called a market economy and price mechanism. But instead, we have this sort of like kludgy corporatist bureaucracy where the team is in charge of it because they're the prime mover there, but also the city council is sort of in charge of it, and the sort of city council staff in various departments because of all the like taxpayer subsidies involved. And they've clearly already got a sort of idea of what they want. They had they had 500 people come in and talk, you know, after presumably they or seemingly that they've come up with most of their idea. But it's not like we have a direct plebiscite when it comes to things like this, when it's not practical to vote on every single aspect of it. So you have, again, the team, which they're not sort of community development experts, but then you also have the city who are not commercial property developers. It seems like we might end up with sort of the worst of all possible worlds, but also the idea that this has become sort of a Christmas tree for every political interest in the city, and so the environmentalists get this giveaway that is going to increase the price, and then the unions get a giveaway that's going to also increase prices long term, uh, and then we also get you know subsidized pole vaulting for disadvantaged youth, and every other random thing that someone with a master's degree in sociology has decided to like tack on to the must-have list. Um, and is there at the end of all of this, is there sort of any accountability in this sort of like Frankenstein plan of major development? Like if it's not efficient, if it doesn't work, if it's too expensive, like what happens? Does the team have to pay back tax money, or are there really any standards at all for success? Is it just we're going to spend $2.7 billion of taxpayer money and that's just the way it's going to be?
Well, the stadium is predicted to be completed in 2030, and the rest of the development isn't projected to be done until 2040 or later. And I think that many of the politicians who approve this will either be out of politics altogether or will have moved on to other offices. Um, and also, it's very difficult from a decade on in hindsight to look back and figure out all the ways that things went wrong. And to answer your question in short, no, there will be no accountability. These sorts of plans are very inflexible things. There's no way for elected officials or for the executives of sports teams to predict um, a decade or two in advance what the needs of individuals in the community will be in so many years. I mean, there's really no way for anyone to make those sorts of predictions. As you alluded to in your comment about markets and prices, these things can only be determined on an ongoing basis in which all of the relevant actors, meaning private citizens, meaning businesses, schools, city officials, react in time and are able to adjust and address specific needs that crop up that are felt and that are voiced by the people who need them. And there's simply no way from this vantage point, this very early stage, to look forward and set some sort of comprehensive economic plan. Really, I should say economic and social plan to fulfill all of the needs of the citizens of DC and to look forward and really assume that all problems of the next decades can be solved today.
Well, yeah, so I've been, sort of salty about deals like this for a long time, for maybe the reasons we've already discussed, but also because they're literally welfare for billionaires, which feels like which feels kind of un-American to me. Maybe it is pretty American. Maybe it should be un-American. Basically, stadium deals in particular, every major league franchise in this country is essentially owned by a billionaire or a small handful of co-owners who together are have a net worth of $1 billion. Uh, and I wonder how we have a culture in this country which, on the one hand, is deeply cynical about rich people, right? About them getting unfair favors and special privileges. You know, people sort of roll their eyes at CEOs and just assume that they're all getting some special sweetheart deals in one way or another. Um, and yet we have all of these subsidy deals, which seem to be politically popular, where we're handing out hundreds of millions of dollars to like the richest people in the country. Um, what put on your like sociologist hat for a second. Like, why is that? Like, why do we not have more kind of like populist outrage about giving away hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars?
Well, I think it comes down to the fact that Americans and people in general are not particularly ideological. They have certain very strong tendencies in their thinking toward certain principles, but they're very happy to make exceptions when exceptions seem, from a common sense perspective, to make sense. There's some very interesting data in a Cato Institute raft of polling on trade that came out last year. And essentially, what they found is that Americans think that American businesses should be able to stand on their own 2 feet and compete in a free market. But also, probably the government should be doing some things here and there to help American businesses remain competitive. And there's an inherent tension in that. And with respect to the stadium subsidy issue, I think there's a race to the bottom insofar as almost every city seems willing to shell out however much money it needs to keep its sports franchise in town. Um, and that's notwithstanding the fact that sports franchises often just up and leave. They go somewhere else, and then they leave taxpayers on the hook for very large amounts of money. Now, if I could say one good thing about my home region of Southern California, the football stadium there, in which the Chargers and the Rams play, was actually was paid for without any public subsidization. And so, I mean, we could hope that that's the beginning of a movement away from publicly funded stadiums. But at the same time, I think until more people in city governments are willing to break from the line, until they're willing to take some hard stances and present sports teams with hard choices, there'll probably be little movement in the right direction. Now, I think one thing that cities underestimate is that they have a lot more leverage in many cases than they assume. There are teams that are sort of mobile and ready to leave. But in the case of a city like Washington, where are the Commanders going to go? Maryland doesn't want them. Virginia, the talks have fallen through there. Um, and there's a very good chance that had the negotiations not been rushed so much, and had the city tried to drive a harder bargain, it could have gotten something much better out of the Commanders, which may not have led to an ideal outcome of no subsidization. Um, it likely would have ended up with a better deal for DC taxpayers.
Yeah, and it's interesting to look at what's going on in other cities, other big cities in America to sort of compare decisions made here. So not so much about stadiums. When you talked about the master plan for the RFK Stadium site, that the new stadium for the Commanders is only one part, maybe the largest single part, but only one part, um, where it's practically an entire new town is being planned, right, between housing and entertainment and amenities. And how different is it to say DC government is going to micromanage this plan and make sure that that there's a full service grocery store in the middle of this parcel? How different is that from Zoran Mamdani running for the mayor of New York City saying, "Oh, well, we're going to have city-run grocery stores in food deserts to make sure that everyone has a like grocery store close to them." A proposal that has gotten a massive amount of pushback and certainly from sort of conservative libertarian side widely mocked. Isn't this sort of kind of New York City public grocery store light in that we're trying to we're trying to sort of like uh, the DC city government seems to be trying to precisely plan individual businesses in individual neighborhoods?
Well, it certainly springs from the same impulse. And unfortunately, whenever the government starts trying to plan these sorts of things, it neglects asking the real questions, which is why aren't there grocery stores in so-called food deserts? If there's a need for more food supply, why isn't that need being met? There is likely some sort of impediment that's blocking access to this kind of thing. Um, and in this sort of case, I think it's important to remember that many of the bad outcomes that we see in large cities are the products of bad policy, whether that be poor policing, whether that be poor zoning regulations. When people are collected in a large area like this, there's certainly the demand to have the basic goods and services that allow people to live good lives. And when the city runs off on these sort of quixotic quests, um, there is a I guess there's this idea that you can put the band-aid over a broken bone or something like that. You can just try to do the thing that you want to be done without addressing the underlying causes of bad governance that has created the larger problem. And frankly, especially when endeavoring this sort of massive plan, I think it's important to realize that the success of the plan is largely dependent on those underlying causes being addressed.
Well, yeah, and I think the again the sort of prescriptive complexity of something like this uh, is part of the problem, right? Because again, if you have these, again, you have sort of like labor agreements, you have environmental side agreements, you have this long list of sort of required slash desired amenities, meaning that in order to comply with the plan, anyone who wants to build anything, whether it's a grocery store or a dry cleaner or a nail salon or anything else, has to fit their business into this like bizarre non-Euclidean box, right? Where you've got one regulation coming on here and another regulation coming on here, and you can build a grocery store, but it has to be in these three blocks because that's where we've decided the grocery store needs to be. And it becomes much more expensive and complicated for someone to fit themselves into this Byzantine master plan than it would be for someone to open a normal business because there's demand for that business there. And so, it seems to me that the city and sort of urban planners in general, in lots of places, they want to create uh, environment that has certain things, and in order to make sure those certain things appear, right? Because we're not in most places we're not literally proposing that the government is going to operate every business. But so in order to make sure that like the exact mix of businesses they want appear, they write 100 rules, but the 100 rules make it impossible for those things to actually appear because it makes it more complicated, difficult, annoying, and slow for anyone who's actually operating a business. And so it seems like there's definitely a lack of confidence in any sort of, market force. The idea that like in a neighborhood where there is a like legitimate market demand for certain businesses and reasonable amount of public safety, then those businesses will move in there because there's money sitting on the table. Um, and and so it's sort of, like the in Star Wars when Princess Leia tells Grand Moff Tarkin, the more you tighten your grip, the more systems will slip between your fingers. It seems like the more the city planners try to tighten their grip around a specific plan, the harder it is for it to actually happen, just because it becomes slower and more complicated.
Well, you've hit on the cruel contradiction of this whole debacle. Um, the DC city government and the commanders felt it necessary to build up their promises to various interest groups and to the public brick by brick, adding one brick for the environmentalists, one brick for the labor unions, et cetera, so on and so forth. And all of that weighs down the actual execution of the plan and likely will make it impossible to accomplish, especially over the very long time frame which has been laid out. I mean, the fact is that government programs, very narrow government programs, are hard enough to execute as it is. And when you have something like this that is a boondoggle and is just has a tremendous and somewhat astonishing scope, is even more likely to fail at the end of the day.
So, tough question. Do you think there will be cost overruns?
I think it's almost entirely certain that there will be. The commanders will soak up some or all of that, per the terms of some tweaks that were made to the deal, which is good. I mean, the commander should have every financial incentive to to work in an efficient way, both with respect to time and to money. However, I think the renegotiated package that was dropped shortly below the vote by the DC City Council Chair Mendelson, it was sort of the variety of lipstick on a pig. They had this obviously deficient deal. So certain cosmetic changes were made to it, which some of which were legitimately beneficial for the city and for the taxpayers and for the residents. But there was no saving this because, as I said, the deal was done before it was even made. There was a decision that was made by DC politicians that they would do whatever they had to do to get the commanders to come back to DC. And any kind of tweaks that can be made following that announcement were at best road bumps on this path that had been foreordained. We all knew where the vote was going. We all knew that this was a certainty, I should say, from the very beginning. And it's exactly that kind of lack of accountability, really, from the start, that has produced such a terrible deal.
So we basically assuming the fix is in, but on some of these major votes in DC, as I'm sure in other places as well, they require multiple kind of procedural votes. So where are we now in the process? Do we have more votes going forward? And are there any other major gateways to get through before they start spending our money?
The initial vote was held and passed 9-3 or excuse me, on August 1st, and there will be a second vote in September. Um, Now, there has been, I think, some sort of pushback since the initial vote, though I'm not sure that it will be enough to sway any votes, let alone the requisite number to stop the deal.
All right. Well, we're pushing right now. All right. David, thank you so much for joining us here. And before we go, tell people where they should go to find all of your excellent work on the internet.
Well, you can go to protectingtaxpayers.org, or more directly, you can go to X and find me at David B. McGarry.
All right. Thanks again, David.
Thank you so much.